The fans may have loved them at first, because after all, they've built a career by acting well. But through the corridors of Hollywood, others saw them for what they truly were. Whether misunderstood or just plain obnoxious, these actors were some of the most hated celebrities of their time. Louis B. Mayer. He was the big boss of MGM Studios back in Hollywood's golden era. Now you'd think being the head of one of the most powerful studios would make him a beloved figure, right? Not even close. Mayer wasn't just disliked, he was outright feared by almost everyone who worked under him. This guy ruled Hollywood with an iron fist and ensured you knew it. First off, Mayer had this obsession with control. To him, his stars weren't just actors, they were investments, commodities he could shape and manipulate however he saw fit. He didn't care about their personal feelings or freedom. What mattered was how they contributed to MGM's image and bottom line. For example, he had strict control over his stars' personal lives. If you were under contract with MGM, you didn't just work for Mayer, you belonged to him. Got caught in a scandal? Don't worry, Mayer's team of fixers would swoop in, but not because he cared about you. It was all about protecting MGM's squeaky clean image. He'd cover up affairs, hush up DUIs, and even arrange marriages just to avoid bad press. Oh, and if you dared to step out of line or refused his orders, he'd destroy your career faster than you could say, talkies. Take Judy Garland, for example. Mayer is infamous for how he treated her. He turned her into a star, sure, but at a massive cost. She was barely a teenager when MGM signed her, and Mayer immediately started tearing her down. He told her she was too fat to be a leading lady and put her on a strict diet of black coffee, cigarettes, and diet pills. Can you imagine doing that to a kid? Mayer saw her as a product, not a person, and she paid the price for it with years of addiction and insecurity. Then there's the whole crying routine he was famous for. Mayer had this bizarre tactic where he'd pretend to cry during negotiations, hoping to guilt people into signing terrible deals. But the worst part, he could be ruthless when it came to punishing disobedience. Stars who dared to challenge him often found themselves blacklisted or trapped in their contracts, unable to work for anyone else. He'd use smear campaigns, legal threats, and anything else in his arsenal to keep his empire intact. It was like living under a dictatorship, but with better costumes. Now, don't get me wrong, Mayer was a genius in many ways. He built MGM into a powerhouse and created some of the most iconic films of all time. But behind all of that, there was a man who thrived on control, manipulation, and fear. That's why, even though he was respected for his power, Louis B. Mayer was one of the most hated figures in Hollywood's golden age. Mae West. One of the most controversial and misunderstood figures of Hollywood's golden age is definitely Mae West. She wasn't just ahead of her time, she was light years ahead, which made her a huge target. She had a sharp wit, undeniable charisma, and a no-holds-barred approach to talking about intimacy. But on the other hand, she ruffled all kinds of feathers back in the ultra-conservative 1930s. Here's the thing about Mae. She owned her sexuality, and she made no apologies for it. At a time when women were expected to be demure and ladylike, Mae came out with her double entendres, curve-hugging gowns, and a swagger that screamed confidence. Too much confidence. And for audiences? That was electrifying. People loved her. She could walk into a room and deliver a one-liner that would leave everyone in stitches or blushing. But Hollywood censors? Oh, they hated her. Mae wasn't just pushing boundaries, she was bulldozing through them. Her 1933 film, She Done Him Wrong, yes, the one that gave us the line, "Why don't you come up sometime and see me?"
Why don't you come up sometime, see me?
Was dripping with innuendo. Conservative groups were horrified, calling her films immoral and dangerous. Religious leaders preached against her, calling her the downfall of American values. She became public enemy number one for the censors, who were scrambling to keep Hollywood clean. Then came the infamous Hays Code, a strict set of rules meant to keep movies decent. Mae's work was a big reason the code was enforced so harshly. They wanted to shut her down, and they did everything they could to make her disappear. She was blacklisted by the industry, her scripts were gutted, and her career in film was essentially derailed. But did Mae go quietly? Of course not. Mae shifted gears and took her act to Las Vegas, Broadway, and even radio, where she caused more controversy. In 1937, she appeared on a live broadcast with ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy. Mae, being Mae, turned the innocent puppet routine into a flirtatious back and forth. It was hilarious, but it sent the prudish crowd into a frenzy. NBC received so many complaints that Mae was banned from their airwaves. Yep, banned for talking to a puppet. Here's the interesting part. While the Hollywood elite and the moral crusaders despised her, Mae knew she was making waves. She once said, "I believe in censorship. I made a fortune out of it." That's Mae West in a nutshell, turning society's outrage into a career. She wasn't just a provocateur, she was a trailblazer, proving that women could own their sexuality and still be powerful. So, yeah, Mae West was hated by censors, moralists, and the Hollywood establishment, but she didn't care. She walked away with her head held high, and a legacy that still makes people blush and laugh at the same time. Bette Davis. There's no denying her talent. She was a powerhouse actress who could light up a scene like nobody else. But if you worked with her, chances are you'd walk away either awestruck or swearing never to do it again. Bette was as famous for her feisty personality as she was for her iconic roles, and that made her a lot of enemies in Hollywood. First of all, Bette didn't take crap from anyone. Directors, studio heads, co-stars, it didn't matter who you were. If you crossed her or didn't meet her standards, she'd let you know. And not in a polite behind-closed-doors kind of way. She'd call you out right then and there, sometimes with a sharp comment or an icy glare that could freeze you in your tracks. To some, this was refreshing. She wasn't afraid to fight for what she wanted. But for many, it was just plain intimidating. Take her feud with Jack Warner, the head of Warner Brothers Studios. Bette wanted better scripts and better pay, but Warner saw her as just another actress under contract. When she tried to leave the studio for better opportunities, Warner blocked her at every turn, leading to a very public legal battle. Bette lost the case, but she won something more important: respect. She was one of the first stars to challenge the studio system, and while it made her a pioneer, it also made her a target for resentment. And then there was her legendary rivalry with Joan Crawford. These two couldn't stand each other, and their feud became Hollywood legend. On the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, they took every chance to one-up and undermine each other. Bette reportedly kicked Joan hard enough during one scene to require stitches, and Joan retaliated by wearing lead weights under her costume, making it nearly impossible for Bette to lift her in another scene. It was petty, it was dramatic, and it was everything you'd expect from two divas at the top of their game. Even her co-stars weren't spared. Actor George Brent, who worked with her on multiple films, once called her the most difficult woman in Hollywood. And Miriam Hopkins, her frequent co-star, described working with Bette as a battlefield experience. Hopkins hated her so much that she spread rumors about Bette, saying she had slept her way to the top. Bette, of course, fired back, saying Miriam was just jealous. But here's the thing, Bette wasn't difficult for the sake of being difficult. She cared deeply about her work and had a perfectionist streak a mile wide. She once said, "I will never be below the title," meaning she wouldn't settle for anything less than excellence, whether it was from herself or those around her. That kind of attitude earned her 2 Oscars and countless iconic roles, but it also made her a magnet for conflict. At the end of the day, Bette Davis didn't play by the rules, and that made her both hated and admired in equal measure. She fought tooth and nail for her career, and while she ruffled plenty of feathers along the way, she never apologized for it. Love her or hate her, you couldn't ignore her. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Bing Crosby. To fans, he was the ultimate symbol of smooth, effortless charm. His velvety voice made him a legend with songs like White Christmas, and he seemed like the epitome of the all-American family man in movies like Going My Way. But behind that squeaky clean image, There was a much darker, more complicated reality, and it was his own family who blew the whistle. For years, Bing's public persona was untouchable. He was the guy everyone wanted to invite to Christmas dinner, warm, genial, and endlessly talented. But in 1983, after his death, his eldest son, Gary Crosby, published a tell-all memoir titled Going My Own Way, and let me tell you, it shattered the illusion. According to Gary, Bing wasn't the easygoing dad America thought he was. Instead, Gary described him as a cold, authoritarian figure who ruled the household with an iron fist. One of the most shocking claims was how Bing disciplined his kids. Gary wrote that his father used a thick belt to punish them, often for minor infractions like not finishing dinner or talking back. And this wasn't just your standard strict parenting of the time, it was reportedly brutal both physically and emotionally. Gary said his dad would mock their weight, calling them fatso or bucket butt if they gained a few pounds. Imagine having Bing Crosby, of all people, the voice of calm and Christmas cheer, tearing you down like that. But Gary wasn't the only one with grievances. His brothers also backed up the claims, painting a picture of a man who was distant, demanding, and deeply flawed. Two of Bing's sons, Lindsay and Dennis, struggled with depression and substance abuse for years, and both tragically died by suicide in the late 1980s. Their deaths further fueled speculation about how much their troubled relationship with their father contributed to their struggles. Now, Bing's defenders argue that he came from a different time. He grew up in a strict Irish Catholic household himself, so some say he was just passing down what he'd learned. But let's be real. Being a product of your time doesn't excuse being cruel. Even some of Bing's closest friends admitted he had a temper and could be controlling, especially when it came to his family. The revelations were a huge blow to Bing's reputation. Fans who had adored him for decades suddenly saw him in a completely different light. It was like finding out Santa Claus had a dark side. And while some still choose to focus on his contributions to music and film, others can't overlook the pain he caused behind closed doors. So, Bing Crosby? A beloved icon on the surface, but his memory is forever complicated by the shadows his family exposed. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's a reminder that even the brightest stars can have a darker side. Erich von Stroheim. This guy was so divisive that he literally earned the nickname the man you love to hate, and honestly, it fit him perfectly. Stroheim was a visionary filmmaker and actor, but his colossal ego, perfectionism, and flair for the dramatic made him a nightmare for everyone who had to work with him. First, let's set the stage. Stroheim was born in Austria, and when he arrived in Hollywood, he leaned hard into this European aristocrat persona. He dressed like a nobleman, spoke with a thick accent, and even claimed to be a count. Spoiler alert, none of that was true. He was just a guy from a middle-class background who knew how to sell himself. But hey, it worked. He became famous for playing villains, the sadistic, monocle-wearing type, and he carried that larger-than-life energy into his career as a director. Now, here's the thing about Stroheim. He was brilliant. Films like Greed and Foolish Wives are considered masterpieces today, but at the time, they were infamous for their chaos behind the scenes. Stroheim demanded absolute control over every aspect of his productions. He wasn't just a perfectionist, he was obsessed. For Greed, he shot over 85 hours of footage, including an insane amount of detail no one would ever see, like gold teeth for extras who barely appeared on screen. Studio executives were tearing their hair out trying to rein him in. And then there was the money. Stroheim was notorious for blowing through budgets like they were monopoly money. Take Foolish Wives, for example. It was billed as the first million-dollar movie, but Stroheim just kept spending, adding ridiculous flourishes like recreating entire European streets for authenticity. Studio heads begged him to scale back, but he refused. For Stroheim, compromise wasn't an option. His behavior on set didn't help either. Stroheim was notoriously demanding and abrasive, treating actors and crew members like chess pieces in his grand vision. Actress Zasu Pitts, one of his regular collaborators, once described working with him as exhausting but brilliant. Others weren't so kind. If you didn't meet his expectations, he'd berate you until you did, or until you quit. Unsurprisingly, studio executives hated him. They saw Stroheim as a liability, a director who couldn't stick to a schedule or a budget. Eventually, they started editing his films without his input, cutting down his epic works into shorter, more marketable versions. This drove Stroheim insane. He considered it a betrayal of his art, and honestly, he never fully recovered from it. By the mid-1920s, his career as a director was basically over. But here's the kicker. Despite all the drama, Stroheim's films are now hailed as some of the greatest of their time. His meticulous attention to detail and his refusal to compromise are the things that made his work stand out, even if they made him impossible to work with. He may have alienated just about everyone in Hollywood, but Stroheim stayed true to his vision, for better or worse. So why was he hated? Because he was brilliant, stubborn, and unapologetically himself, even when it cost him everything. Love him or hate him, Stroheim's work as a Hollywood rebel is undeniable. Norma Shearer. While she was undeniably talented, there were rumors in Hollywood that her career success wasn't solely the result of her acting abilities, but because of her marriage to Irving Thalberg, the head of MGM Studios. Norma was often seen as the beneficiary of unfair advantages. Thalberg, known as the boy wonder of Hollywood, was one of the most powerful men in the business, and his influence helped her rise to the top. Critics and rivals claimed that Norma was handed plum roles that other actresses who were considered more talented or better suited for certain roles didn't get. The idea was that she was being favored, not because of her acting chops, but because she was Thalberg's wife. Her marriage to Thalberg certainly helped open doors, but it also fueled jealousy and resentment from other actresses who felt she didn't have to work as hard for her success. On top of that, she was often typecast as the good girl in MGM's opulent, glamorous productions, roles that critics felt were too easy and not as challenging as those given to other actresses who had to fight for their spots. The real animosity, however, came from her personal life and the perceived privilege she held within the studio. For one thing, Norma was not exactly the best at playing the parts that made her a star, like the virtuous wife or the pure-hearted love interest. Some felt she was much more suited to complex, more rebellious roles, but the studio kept her locked into these lighter, more sanitized characters. Her critics argued that she wasn't just playing it safe with her roles, but that she was being forced into them because of her connection to Thalberg. This perception of preferential treatment followed her through her career, with some claiming that she was given too much creative freedom, like the fact that she was allowed to collaborate on scripts or have a say in casting decisions, while other actresses were fighting tooth and nail to get any creative input at all. As much as Norma was beloved by her fans, the truth was that within Hollywood she often found herself at odds with many of her peers. They accused her of having it easy because of who she was married to. It's like she had this giant target on her back because she was married to one of the most powerful men in the industry, and no matter how hard she worked, some people could never let go of the idea that she had an unfair advantage. The reality might be somewhere in between. She was certainly talented, but her marriage to Thalberg certainly opened doors that others had to fight their way through. Jean Harlow. Her persona on screen was often seen as vulgar and cheap by many in the industry. Her roles frequently played on her sexuality, casting her as the dumb blonde or the seductress, which fueled the stereotype of her as nothing more than a pretty face. Critics didn't just see her as an object of desire, they saw her as a symbol of moral decline. To a conservative Hollywood elite, her overtly sexualized image and the way she embraced her sexuality were dangerous. But the harshest judgment came from her tumultuous personal life. Harlow's relationships, especially her brief, troubled marriage to MGM executive Paul Byrne, were the subject of intense public scrutiny. When Byrne died under mysterious circumstances, rumors swirled that Harlow was involved, further tarnishing her reputation. The media had a field day with her personal life, and Hollywood insiders saw her as someone who couldn't separate her public persona from her private one. The more Hollywood tried to control her image, the more it seemed to alienate her. Her critics painted her as a symbol of Hollywood's tawdry side, someone who existed only to be ogled and whose life was filled with scandal. This portrayal overshadowed the more complex woman behind the scenes. Jean Harlow was, in fact, a highly intelligent, ambitious woman who had a sharp business sense and was actively involved in her career. She was also known for being kind-hearted and generous with those around her. But none of that mattered in the public eye. The more the press sensationalized her image, the more they reduced her to the blonde bombshell trope. On top of this, Jean's fierce determination to succeed in an industry that was dominated by powerful men didn't always sit well with her male counterparts. While she was known to stand her ground and fight for her roles, many saw her as ungrateful or difficult to work with, which only added fuel to the fire. The tragic part? By the time Jean's career was peaking, she was already suffering from health problems, including kidney failure, which would eventually take her life at just 26. Her untimely death only added to her legend, but it also meant she didn't live long enough to truly redefine her image. So, while Jean Harlow was viewed by many as a symbol of Hollywood's excess and scandal, the truth is, her story was much more complicated than the image people had of her. She may have been called vulgar by critics, but in reality she was a pioneering figure in Hollywood, a woman who broke the mold in an industry that demanded conformity. Gloria Swanson. Her feud with director Cecil B. DeMille in particular became a point of tension. Swanson's work with DeMille, especially in the early days of her career, was highly successful. But she wasn't one to bow down to anyone, and as her fame grew, she became more unwilling to take orders. Her departure from DeMille's productions signified a major break, with some saying it was due to her refusal to adhere to the director's traditional ways of working. But it wasn't just her behavior on set that turned people off, it was also her sense of entitlement. Gloria was often accused of trying to control her career and public image in a way that could be seen as manipulative. As one of the biggest stars of the silent film era, she became accustomed to being treated like royalty, and she expected that same level of adoration from everyone around her, even when her star power began to wane.